You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. America is a place full of cases of high strangeness, unusual legends and tribal lore that spans millennia. Joining me to discuss some of the cases included in his fantastic new book, An Anthology of American Strangeness, Volume 1, is author Kevin J Guhl. Kevin is of course the man behind the ThunderbirdPhoto.com website, which in itself is a cryptid conundrum all of its own. But before we join Kevin, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual, and thank you to each and every one of you for your contributions to me and the show. It means a great deal. Thank you. Mysteries and Monsters is across most social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news and episodes. And don't forget, our exclusive merchandise site is available through TeePublic, and you can click the link in the show notes to find our range there. Our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Let's welcome Kevin as we head out on the hunt for the Thunderbird. And much, much more. The United States has a remarkable, unusual parallel history of extreme strangeness and weird occurrences. My guest this episode has been the primary driving force in one of the most perplexing mysteries of the last few years, which is, of course, the missing Thunderbird photo. In his new book, An Anthology of American Strangeness, Volume 1, my guest Kevin J Guhl looks at much more than the Thunderbird. Kevin, I am delighted to finally welcome to you to the show. A big fan of your work. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. I am delighted to be here, Paul.
This is one of those things I think sometimes we try and manifest in the world of the weird, Kevin. Conversations that we hope we can do a show about. And so, having read your site regularly for the last couple of years and seen you mentioned in other researches as someone being, as I said in the introduction, a driving force in regards to this crazy situation we've got with this Thunderbird picture. It's lovely that all of a sudden you kind of message me saying, oh, I've got my new book coming out. And I thought, oh, this is just perfect, Kevin. Things cannot align better than that email, my friend.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. And yeah, I was flattered when you said you were already familiar with my site, because I have such a passion for this. I've been writing on this site for years, but sometimes it's hard to know how far it's going, how far it's reaching. So that was nice.
Well, and I'm not blowing smoke out of my own backside here, Kevin. I think sometimes when you've got somebody you respect and you talk about what you do and they know what you do, or they listen or they read what you write, it really makes you feel a bit, impressed with yourself, because you're like, wow, that person knows who I am. And therefore, to me, that just makes it even better what I'm trying to achieve here.
Yep, they get me. Sure.
Well, we are a broad church in the Fortean world, Kevin. A broad church. Well, as I said in this introduction, this is one of the most perplexing things. I mean, obviously, we have both been interested in these subjects probably since we were childhood, as you say in your introduction into the book. And I'm exactly the same. I grew up loving wonderful weird stories from Greek mythology, from Arabian mythology, British folklore, and then obviously discovering other weird and wonderful things from around the world. And so this Thunderbird situation that we've got, when this kind of came to my attention that people were saying, we've all seen this picture, but nobody can now find it. I as I was saying to you before we started the interview proper, Kevin, I was dumb enough to think, well, what are these people talking about? I'm positive I've got that. And so I checked all my magazines. I mean, I've probably got, I don't know, a couple of thousand magazines dealing with Fortean phenomena. I've got nearly 1,000 books now. I didn't then. And so I was convinced I had this picture. I knew I'd had this picture. I had seen it. And I hadn't. And so when you've got people like Lyle Blackburn, Richard Freeman, Ken Gerhard, Dr. Carl Schuker, Lauren Coleman, all looking for this picture and nobody can find it, then you start thinking, well, has this become a Fortean mystery all of its own, Kevin?
Oh, absolutely. I would say the Thunderbird photo almost preceded the search for the giant birds themselves. My first exposure was just coming across the story online and in recognizing, well, there are clues here that can be followed up upon because I have a background as a journalist. And so, it just sort of triggered that. And so that's how I first met Hammerson Peters. We were both looking for not just the photo, but one of the witnesses, Frank Graves, at the same time. And from there on, Hammerson was one of my first examples of how generous people in the Fortean community can be, because he saw that I was passionate about it. And he said, you know what, this is your baby. Even though he had gathered some information, he put up a great video on it, but he said, do what you're going to do with it. So that's been since 2019, just tracking people down, interviewing people, sort of finding who was in the orbit of Ivan T. Sanderson, he's the one that lit the flame on this search back in 1971-72. So here we are today. I'm putting together a book on that. It's still, it's been a long time in process, and of course the Thunderbird, it's mentioned in the book I just put out too.
I think this is the key thing about this, because for me, the situation we've got here is that there are so many breadcrumbs, especially when we look at American newspaper reports of the late 19th century, Kevin. There are lots of similar stories of cowboys coming across what we would consider to be dinosaurs, pteranodons, and that family ilk. I've read numerous stories of cowboys taking them down when they've tried to attack children, livestock, and you see these stories reported from sort of places like Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Idaho. There are enough tantalizing clues to make you think, well, this is a very strange thing for people to start making up in the 19th century in America. I know often when we look at some of these older newspaper reports, you can see, especially as trains start to be spreading across the United States, how these stories about something 3 states away start to shrink, because now somebody can go, oh, well, I'm going to go there. My local newspaper has told me moon-eyed people live in this town, and anybody from outside of it goes there, they get eaten. I'm going to go there and see if this is true. And then they go there and it's absolutely fine. There's nothing weird about this town at all.
So that's kind of marketing, really.
Yes. And so it's one of those strange aspects of some of these reports, because people say, oh, well, they just made it up. And I thought, well, we didn't really know much about dinosaurs 150 years ago, especially on the frontier. And I've often said this, that there is this presumption, especially when we're dealing with historical Bigfoot reports that are reported in American and Canadian newspapers as well. A lot of people say, oh, well, they must have read something and just made it up. And I think, well, I suspect that the vast majority of people who were out there at that time probably couldn't read, and probably didn't have access to newspapers as well, especially regular. And I find it very hard to believe that a local newspaper in Ohio would be carrying reports of discoveries of gorillas in Africa for some reason, when I think they'd be more worried about local troubles or the ramifications of the Civil War, or perhaps a gold boom.
I think, the 19th century, well, first of all, I mean, you had syndication was starting up. So you do see like some of those reports appear in multiple newspapers. I think there was a hunger for news of, the frontier and, things that were really just, new and exciting. There definitely, it was kind of funny to read a newspaper back then and see that like a story about a dragon or a sea serpent or an airship right next to like what happened at the local council meeting. And a lot of it, I'm sure, was editors being creative. But some of those stories clearly seem like hoaxes. But then there are others where it's like it feels like there's like a grain of truth, like the names check out. Maybe somebody's just writing a fun story about people they know. But you do wonder if there isn't some kind of weird circumstance or local tradition that's coming out in those stories. So that's what I've always tried to do. Like, I don't want to just, I could just reprint the tale, but I want to dig into it and see, what were the historical circumstances at the time? Who were these people? What was going on? And sometimes you get a story that's just as interesting as the cryptid that was, or whatever it was that was in the newspaper.
Absolutely. And there's enough evidence from around the world of strange creatures being described who, at that time, people would scoff at and say, absolute nonsense. I mean, it's very well reported, as I mentioned earlier, about some of the reports of gorillas, and people just thought that was absolute nonsense at the late 19th century, until sadly they had to kill them to bring it back. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my God, what on earth is this wonderful creature? And you look at some of the strange things and histories that are attached to creatures like oarfish, which is often one of those things that people say, oh, well, if anybody reports a sea serpent, they've seen an oarfish, which is usually one of those explanations where whoever's saying it, they've just seen a picture of an oarfish and have no idea that oarfish are probably the laziest buggers in the sea. They just float about. They very rarely come to the surface unless they're dying. And I find that very hard to believe that they're jumping in and out of water and attacking ships, with the greatest of respect. And so when we get these weird little things at that particular point in history, people are going to be sceptical about it. You can only imagine what people thought in Australia when they saw a kangaroo for the first time, for God's sake. Or famously here, people refused to believe that the platypus was a real creature. And even when they had a sample...
That feels like the jackalope.
Yes.
It feels made up.
Yeah. And even when they got a sample, they thought it had been stuck together. They didn't believe it. They had to dissect it to find out it was a real creature. And even so, it's still weird. You know, here we've got something that's almost a mammal, that's got a beak, and it lays eggs, and it's venomous. And you're like, what? What is going on here?
If that's true, why wouldn't this story about a dragon be true? News of dinosaurs. I mean, I think it was interesting that the pterosaur was discovered. It was the first one discovered outside of Europe was in Kansas in the mid 1800s. So shortly after that, you do see some of these dragons, stories like follow that. So you do wonder if that is an influence, for sure.
Very much so. And you even if we're talking about dinosaurs, Kevin, it's a prime example. When I was a kid growing up, dinosaurs were all lizards everywhere. And that was it. They were lizards, and that was all that matters.
Recreation.
Now it's obviously no, they're not. Everybody says, oh, well, they're actually birds. And so we now know that modern birds, you look at your cassowaries, your ostriches, your chickens, they're basically dinosaurs. So when you have chicken for dinner, you're eating dinosaur, really. And so that's only like 45, 50 years. But obviously those shoots of discussion were going on when I was a child, reading about dinosaurs and discovering a love of these incredible creatures that used to roam the earth. Whereas now, it's completely different. And you see a dinosaur on television these days, they're all brightly coloured and covered in sort of hair and feathers and things. Whereas before, everything was green and grey and scaly.
I miss the old King Kong, Harryhausen animation dinosaurs.
Yes.
Smooth-skinned and awkward and wonderful.
Absolutely. But still more realistic than a man in a suit, Kevin.
Yes. I am not going to put down Godzilla movies. I have a ton of Godzilla figures up on my shelf, which I know is not on here, but you can see.
I am the same. Godzilla is my jam, has been since I was a very small boy and corrupted early with Destroy All Monsters, which is still one of my favourites.
Classic.
The Thunderbird then is just becoming an enigma for us, really, because as I was saying, we've got these trail of breadcrumbs of some of these stories from there. But there is also this perception that we know that giant birds have existed into the modern era. They're not just myth and legend and dinosaurs from the past. These are a well-documented series of creatures over the years. There are skeletons that we've seen and bodies that we've recovered from the past that show us the incredible size some of these creatures used to get to, like the Quetzalcoatl bird. And you even look at some of the creatures that existed into sort of the Middle Ages, the Harst eagle, the moa. These are legendary creatures. And when we start to look around in some of the ancient languages and some of the stories that they were telling 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years ago, giant birds are a factor in a lot of mythology, be it Greek, Arabian, Roman. There are stories of people having encounters with enormous, mostly what would seem to be giant eagles of some description. Mm-hmm. Sinbad is probably the best example with his 2 encounters with the rock. I mean, it's bad enough to meet it once, Kevin, but Sinbad, bless him, ends up having 2 sort of skirmishes with it and comes off rather badly both times. Not for him.
The skin of his teeth on that second.
He gets, it's bad enough to nearly die by the hands of, the claws of them once, but to end up being in that situation twice. I mean, the second encounter is one of those where you can see this is a man who has been suffering some trauma from his first encounter on that second voyage, because he's telling everybody, leave those eggs alone.
They don't listen.
No. And everybody dies apart from Sinbad because nobody listened. And it's one of those sort of, there's a lot of moral behaviors in these stories, a lot of kind of, I told you so, be careful what you wish for. And so that for me was my kind of first introduction into giant birds of that kind of ilk, really. Seeing those films from the 70s and 80s and then reading the Arabian Nights in my teens and falling in love with it all over again and realizing that Sinbad wasn't a swashbuckling hero. He was just probably the world's unluckiest merchant, or very lucky, depending on how you want to view that kind of thing, because he always seems to come out of those stories smelling of roses somehow.
At the time, he probably didn't feel lucky, but then later, when he survived and became immortal through his stories, then maybe.
Absolutely. And so when I think about these stories like Sinbad's Rock and the other giant creatures and birds of that ilk, and then I look at, as I say, creatures like the Harst eagle that fed on mowers, that's died off in the last, I think, 400 years. But there are still, once again, stories of that maybe still surviving somewhere on a Pacific island. And who's to know, there's that many islands in the Pacific, and birds have incredible flight times. We can see that in the modern era with the wandering albatross and the condors, how big their ranges can be. That for me then takes it into a different level, because we know that there are large birds out there. We know that large birds have existed in the past. Why do we think that they can't be out there now? That's so frustrating.
It is. I think, you think of Bigfoot, it can disappear into the trees. Birds, you would think, would be more visible. And even though the thought is that they might be nocturnal. But so I can understand it's one of those puzzles where I've talked to many people who have seen these birds, and they live with the paradox that it doesn't quite make sense, but they saw it. So, they are harder to hide, but, you do wonder, could there even just be larger variations of known birds, right? And you have John J. Audubon talked about Washington's eagle, which was a larger eagle that some people think was a hoax to sell books, but he also claimed to have seen different specimens. So was there this, somewhat larger bird of prey out there, during that era that maybe has gone extinct? Maybe it's in small numbers. Mm-hmm. I like to think that there are possibilities like that for sure.
Well, even if you talk about modern birds and some of the stresses that they've had on their populations, and all of a sudden they become protected species, and suddenly you see them rebound incredibly. Eagles, especially here in the UK, were pushed really to the brink. And there's been a real drive over the last sort of 40 or 30 years to sort of protect and preserve these creatures and allow them to sort of bounce back. The numbers are rising incredibly for all creatures of that ilk. And so when conservation gets involved, it really does seem to make a difference for these, even though we're talking about creatures that will build nests in really sort of difficult places to go. Unfortunately, there will be people that prize their egg or their a specimen for whatever reason, and will go, clamber up inhospitable mountain ranges and all sorts just to get this prize. And so
the California condor is one excellent example of what you're saying. There are, back in the the 1800s, the early 1900s, their eggs were prized possessions. People would dare climbing into their caves to take these, and the result was the California condor almost went extinct. This was an animal that in the Pleistocene ranged across North America, which, by the way, it existed. There was also the Territorn, which are, the ancestors of the indigenous people would certainly have lived with, and you might be an influence in those stories. But going back, so the condor was almost extinct. All of the surviving individuals were pulled out of the wild, and there was a breeding program that lasted several years, and now they've been introduced, and they're actually starting to spread out beyond California. There was an article, if you look it up, a couple of years ago, where a woman awoke one morning to find about 20 of them perched on her deck. Oh. These giant condors. Pretty amazing.
Wonderful and terrifying to take, especially first thing on the morning.
But it is a little terrifying. But they're not going to hurt you. They're carrion birds. They're just big.
For me as well, the other sort of kernels for this particular mystery. And whilst I know we're talking more of sort of traditional birds before we return to the sort of scaly winged Thunderbird.
I think at some point you might want to define it, because Thunderbird, it gets confusing because it's not one thing.
Yes.
It's sort of a collective idea that means different things to different people.
Yes.
I mean, I'll explain it if you want.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing, because it's such a term that people, as you say, I think as soon as you say it, people have a preconceived idea. Whereas for people like ourselves, we understand it's more of an umbrella term. And there's different parts of it. There's different members. It's not what people would consider a pterodome. It's not what somebody would consider just an eagle. It's amalgamations of giant birds of a variety of types, isn't it?
It definitely is. The term belongs, of course, to Native Americans. It was such an important tradition that there was a version of it in almost every group of people across North America. And it was, but even in there, it wasn't one thing, right? It was influenced by the landscape. In the Pacific Northwest, it was more of a flesh and blood large raptor that would snatch whales from the ocean, which of course it was a whaling culture, and whaling cultures up there, and take them to the top of mountains and eat them. And the natives would sometimes say they found the bones of the whales up on the mountains, which you wonder if that was left there from previous times when it was flooded. Then you have in some cultures the Thunderbird is more, it's a person, it's a thunderer, but in those cases there's often still a monster bird who may not be like the Thunderbird, and it's and it has a spirit, but overall it has a spiritual meaning. It's the go-between between the upper realm and earth. It's life-giving yet terrifying, the way storms can bring death, and life through rain. So there's a lot of meaning there. But then as far back as I can track it, in the 1960s, there was a gentleman named Hiram M. Kramer in Pennsylvania who ties into the whole photo story and everything. But he started writing. He was influenced by, I think, stories of the Piazza in Illinois.
Yes.
Which is I'm sure you know all about that. But he also believed he was seeing large birds in the rural sections of Pennsylvania where he lived, north central mountainous Pennsylvania. So he started writing articles to like Fate magazine and elsewhere about Thunderbirds, obviously referring to the Native American entity, but applying it to like non-spiritual, like flesh and blood large birds. So that's how that took off. But now we're encompassing, the original Tombstone story was more of a dragon-like creature, and those stories have become intertwined. So it's really this mix of stories, and you wonder, where the truth lies in there. It feels like it could be a mix of perhaps different influences.
I think for me, one of the intriguing things about this is not only am I one of those people, as I said, some of the greatest luminaries in modern crypto, as well as you're all in this boat together, Kevin. We all think we've seen this picture 30, 40 years ago.
Well, I want to hear what's your memory of it? Will you share that with us?
I remember reading an article and seeing a picture of it as a teenager, I think. So I'm placing this sort of early to mid-80s, I think. And reading a story about giant birds, and it mentions the tombstone and it has the picture. That's my memory of it, in an article about giant birds from around the world. So it mentioned things like the rock and some of the weird cases that we've had over the years especially in the 20th century. There are two perfect cases I can think of children allegedly carried away or attacked by giant birds, one in the States, one in Norway. And so for me, that's where it's fixed. I can see it being a yellowy sort of picture, looking old in a time. And so for me, when I then came across this modern sort of pursuit of this picture, I was gobsmacked at first. I thought, why does nobody know where this picture's from? I know where it's from. I'm sure I've got it. And I went through everything, couldn't find it. And then I realised, well, what's going on here? And then I start thinking, well, this is even more mysterious. Why do we all, from wherever we are in the world, even in the days before social media and the internet connected us all, we're all convinced we've seen this picture? How can we all have this idea that we've all seen it? And we haven't sort of, because I can tell you all kinds of things from that particular period, Kevin, that are real. I know when I saw TV shows and films and certain bands and records coming out and watching strange things on telly that shouldn't have happened. and they've become synonymous with great TV bloopers and things like that. I can remember all that, but I can't find this. And therefore, that's led me thinking to start postulating what on earth is going on.
Right. It's, some people cite the Mandela effect. It's almost like it existed and has been pulled from our universe.
Smithsonian.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, the more scientific theory is that it's a false memory, and that this is a incredibly powerful trigger. I mean, so many people, they hear the story, and just like you, they remember seeing it. Some even remember it was in a specific book. One of my favorite examples was there's a book, Mystery of the Unexplained by Reader's Digest. I have a copy of it.
Same.
And they even remember like what page it was on. But you know what's on that page? There's no photo, but there's a story, a famous old newspaper story about workers in France building a road or a tunnel, and they break through the rock, and a pterodactyl stumbles out and perishes at their feet.
Yes.
So is it a our brains are, they're not video recording, they're not digital recordings, our brains make connections between things and sort of file them away. And sometimes that might get mixed up. Now, on the other hand, so many people remember this photo, and the further I've gone back in time. So I mentioned Ivan T. Sanderson, the famous writer, Oregon writer, biologist. He's not the first one to mention the photo, but he was the first one to say, I had a copy of this and it's no longer here, and I'd like to get a copy. And that's how this started back in the early 70s. And I've had the good fortune of interviewing some people who knew Sanderson personally, were there at the time he would have had it, which was when he was running the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And these people I wouldn't say unconnected, but they haven't spoken in years. I've interviewed them and done my best to not, influence the conversation, and they have memories of it. And they're very similar memories of sitting there at his desk. He had all kinds of books and magazines on the shelves, and he had a file, and he showed them this. Some of them described it as like a copy, from a newspaper, but the picture was apparently of good quality enough to make an impression. So that gives me hope that, there is something to this, but it's always associated with that Tombstone, Arizona story, which isn't about a bird at all. And most people, some people think it shows like a prehistoric pteranodon, but it talks about a bird, like a bird with a 36-foot wingspan, pinned up against a barn, about half a dozen cowboys in front of it, arms stretched out to show the wingspan of the bird, black and white photo. A lot of people remember this image. There's an illustration of somebody who remembers it did for my website that a lot of people have said that's the closest they've seen to what they remember. So I put that right on top. I'm like, does this trigger anything?
Well, it does, because that's exactly, it's the best interpretation of what I think I have seen.
Is it? Okay. Okay. Andrew Minier drew that, great illustrator, and he was very generous to say use it however you want.
I mean, this is one of those things as well, like you say, we laugh about some of the conspiracies that line up about this, but you only have to delve into the world of giants, Kevin, to see this parallel reality that exists. The Smithsonian take them all the time. The
Smithsonian is apparently, a giant conspiracy machine. I feel so bad for the employees now. It's nice to me when I've investigated. There's one of the chapters in the book, I had a nice. They really helped me out in looking for something, and so I feel a little bad, but a lot of people think that they were responsible for destroying giants up to like surviving mammoths there was a story that Thomas Jefferson instructed them to destroy the remains of a mammoth, like a living mammoth that were found, during his presidency. So that's definitely a thing.
Absolutely. Well, we all know they're still hiding in Alaska, Kevin.
I know. There are. I hope so. Right.
Yeah.
But there's a plan to bring them back, though, which I think is it could have environmental benefits. So. Yes,
absolutely. But I'm always of the principle of it's all very well and good saying yes. Well, we'll just dump them here and they'll be fine.
Yeah.
Do they forget that animals don't follow rules?
True. They came to be in a very specific time and place with certain things they needed for their survival. So is that being met, or are they going to go elsewhere? You're getting into Jurassic Park territory.
Yeah, I mean, they're a very interesting thing as well, like you say, because along with the Tasmanian tiger, they're probably sort of the poster creatures for resurrecting extinct species. And yet we still get surprised. We recently here, we had a very ill-fated railway project that was going on. And so they were digging up large swathes of the south and the middle counties here. And one of the digs, they discovered an old tar pit with several mammoth skeletons in it. And that was quite a remarkable find for here in the UK, because we do find some strange things, like they found hyenas and things in the past when you could walk to the UK before the end of the Ice Age. We were basically connected to Europe with a land bridge. And so things like that don't surprise me, that even into the modern era, we've, once again, mammoths, everybody said, oh yeah, they died out about 10,000 years ago. Now we're saying they think they may have survived on an island off Alaska for another till about 3,000 years ago. So straight away already in the last 20 years, we've pulled them back 7,000 years, Kevin. Are we going to discover something in the next 10, 20 years which pulls them back to 500 years ago in the northern reaches of Canada and Alaska and Siberia, perhaps?
I mean, it's just a matter of stumbling across a fossil, not even a fossil, like the remains. So for sure, there were so many unexplored expanses, and the communication wasn't so that, say, like a local Inuit tribe or something like that saw them, that's going to make its way outside of their community. So,
and sure. you only have to look at some of the discoveries they make in the Siberian permafrost of saber-toothed tigers and things, and it's almost as if they've been there 20 years. Not 15,000 years sometimes. It is, the preservation of some of these corpses is incredible.
Yeah, there was just was it a leopard cub or something? I think there was just a recent discovery of like a cub of I believe it was an extinct cat.
I suppose one of the intriguing things about this, as we say, about the Smithsonian stealing all these skeletons and evidence of it, is that one of the most strange occurrences about giant birds that I'm aware of in the last sort of 15 years was the fact that they discovered some very similar to kind of like an albatross that was discovered, I think it was in South Carolina in the 80s. They found the skeleton, and it took them 30 years to identify it. And then it became the biggest bird that's ever been known, which essentially had the wingspan twice the size of the wandering albatross.
Yep. But it was even larger than Argentavis, which was the previous. I believe I'm just going to warn you, I slaughter pronunciations all the time. I'm such my brain to the keyboard is the best communication route when I have to pronounce it. So I think it's Paragrornis, or it's not, I'm thinking of Paragrornis, but it's something like that. It's certainly what you're describing. Yeah. So it's the largest, crazy large wingspan.
But that was in a drawer for 30 years.
Yeah.
So you would suggest, is there something else in a drawer somewhere? I mean, this happens more often than not sometimes, where they'll get some work experience peoples in, or some apprentices in, Kevin, into a museum, and they go into that dusty room that nobody's been in since Brian left in 1984, and they open a drawer, and all of a sudden they find teeth from a creature that has been misclassified or something. So it does happen. This isn't I think this is the misunderstanding we sometimes get. Some of these establishments have such large swathes of uncatalogued evidence that things like this, people go, oh, well, they must have been sat on it for ages. It's just, I don't think they've got the time or the resources to catalogue everything properly. And it's only when you get somebody who's passionate about a particular tranche of history or biology that they start digging into things, that these discoveries are remade, because we've got them. It's just that somebody's just put them to one side and forgot.
Yeah, it's just, just put in a filing cabinet. I mean, these museums, they're short staffed like any other business, any other organization. So you're right. Somebody just may forget to look into a box for a few decades. And another thing with the bird specimens, bird skeletons are so delicate that, we're lucky that we find these samples at all. I mean, Terratornis, we're lucky. Like you mentioned, the tar pit. It's like in California, you have the La Brea tar pits. I think, we have several examples of them in other animals in there, but that's only because of the nature of it, that they got sucked in and it was preserved.
Would you say this is probably modern cryptozoology's biggest detective story at the moment, Kevin?
I don't know, there are many. It's definitely one of the most, I would say it's one of the most popular in that people have a real interest in it. Anytime anybody posts about it, it gets a lot of attention. So it definitely, it intrigues people. And I think that's because it manages to be both a search for a cryptid and a treasure hunt. You know, it's like we're looking for an artifact like Indiana Jones, this amazing photo that could prove, visual evidence of a magnificent creature that we didn't know existed. It could also prove to be a fake that was really good, but then we would know, then we would at least know, or whatever it is, there's a backstory to investigate. But anything that gets solved kind of loses its luster as well, don't you think? I mean, I feel like the search, I don't know how much you follow other lost media, but are you familiar with the story of celebrity number 6?
Oh, it rings a bell, but I'm not that well versed in it. But as soon as you said that, I thought I know what you're on about, but I'm not too sure about what the content of it is.
So, short version, there's a material. I think it's material you can use for sheets or clothes that a company sold, and it had sort of like stylized drawings of different celebrities from like the early 2000s. And most of them are identified, but there's this one mystery person on there. No one could figure out who it is. So there was this big online community searching for this for years. And just a couple months ago, it was solved. Someone got in touch with, it turns out it was a model. I forget what country she was from, but, they found, she produced the original photographs. They were like, for like a style shoot, an advertising shoot. And that was awesome because they found it. But after that, you watch the online communities just kind of fade away. It's like it built something in the search. So I'm not saying I don't want these things to be found, but at the same time, there is such a joy in the mystery of it, for sure.
Absolutely. Often it's the chase, isn't it, more than anything that drives us, Kevin? And I've said this before when I've spoke to people. What would we do if we prove Bigfoot's real? What do we do? Yes, and I think sometimes we don't think about that particular aspect of it, that once it's so, that would be incredible and that would be remarkable, regardless. But then you think, well, what are we all going to do then?
There will be something else, I'm sure.
Dogman.
But it's, but I think that I really think that I kind of get it. I think I get at this a little bit in the book. I feel like it's that's what drives the passion for these stories. It's the fact that they're unsolved and they're intriguing. And I hope that once these things are found that, people get that kind of satisfaction. But obviously, like proving Bigfoot would be, a major scientific discovery. So,
yeah, well, stranger things have happened. He says.
Well, I didn't think we'd be where we are with UFOs. I followed it forever and believed in it. And I'm cautious about who I talk about it with. I've never seen anything, but here we are. It's like there are congressional hearings on. I never expected that. We'll see where it goes, but so anything can happen.
Yeah, exactly. And they're only scratching the surface, really, which is the other aspect of all this. They're only dealing with a very small segment of the whole phenomenon.
Sure.
And I'm the same as you. I'm completely.
It's got to start somewhere.
Yes.
I think it's important that they're trying to reduce the stigma for pilots and. For everybody, but the cases they're looking at are professional pilots who are them and their instruments should be taken seriously.
Yeah, very much so. I suppose this Thunderbird thing as well, when you're delving into this and looking backwards, I suppose one of the other aspects is stumbling across strange stories that perhaps have been forgotten about or overlooked. And as I mentioned earlier, there are two stories that always stick in my mind in the 20th century when we talk about giant birds and attacks. Probably for people in North America, the most famous is Marlon Law in Illinois in 1977. And I suppose it's a prime example of talking to the press and not realizing the monster you unleash, because what happened to him and that family afterwards is quite horrific, really, because he was bullied in school. Everybody used to shout "bird boy" at him. People used to shout bird calls through their letterboxes. The family were just harassed for years and just basically said, we don't want to talk about this. And I know you did an article a few months ago touching on Marlon, because he's basically disappeared. He's one of those people a lot of us out there would love to have a chance to speak to. And it looked like someone was finally going to get a chance to finally speak to him and get it from the horse's mouth, as it were.
But he was. There's a recent show that aired called The Lost Monster Files, Discovery Plus. They actually went to the Ivan T. Sanderson archive of the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained, and they did interview Marlin on an episode about Thunderbird. So he did, it was neat. It was great to see him, because I know he did interviews early on. I think he's kind of shied away from it, from what I understand. I know he's had a lot of hard times because of it. The only thing about that, and I don't want to get into that show, but they interviewed him in Pennsylvania, and I feel like they kind of fudged, like they made it seem like just by inference that this happened in Pennsylvania, because that's what they were talking about. But of course it was in Illinois. So
yes, yeah.
But Marlin's not alone, because one thing you learn going through papers, like eagles trying to take children, it's upsettingly common when you go back over the last few hundred years. It's, American settlers, European settlers were moving into areas that, had a larger population of these birds. Small children, I think there's a difference between a bird actually carrying a child away and attempting to do it, which I think is what happened with Marlin. The description they give of the birds is very puzzling. Like it doesn't really match anything that should be there.
Yes.
In a lot of those stories, they are eagles, golden eagles, even bald eagles that have done this. In reality, or just in science, inexperienced birds will try that. It's happened as recently as there was a case, you mentioned it, and there was a case in New England just like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago on the beach. There was a young eagle. People were feeding it, which it should not do. And at one point there was a little kid and it tried to take off with her. And of course they stopped it. So I don't have a problem believing the Marlin Lowe story. It definitely, you wonder, it's very interesting. The birds they describe almost sound like Andean condors, and condors shouldn't be picking up a person or anything like that anyway. They don't have the strength in their claws. So that's a puzzle. Sure.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned there, I've been reading recently that there's a weird situation going on in Norway where there is a golden eagle going around attacking children.
Oh.
And I think there's been 4 attacks in the last few months.
I got to look that one up.
I was reading about that the other day, because obviously my brother's wife lived in Norway. They got married in Norway, so I'm always keeping my eye out on strange things from Norway, because Scandinavia is an area full of magic and mystery, and so if it's not trying to find if there are any troll sightings in the modern era, I'm always keeping my eye out for anything else. And then I stumbled across this weird series of attacks that's currently going on. I think the last one was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So when we finish, I'll send you the link over, because I was reading it a couple of days ago, so it'll be in my browsing history, so I can pull it up for you.
I would like to see that. It definitely sounds like an eagle to look out for.
Yeah, literally, yes. But also Norway has an infamous bird attack story which featured a young girl called Svenhild Hansen, I believe.
Yeah, I think that goes back. It was at the 1700s, I believe. I think that was.
No,
thinking of the one in Switzerland. But go on.
Yes, yeah. The Swiss one, yes. But this one is 1932.
Okay. Yep.
She was playing outside in her family's farm. Her parents saw her playing. They did something for 5 minutes, turned around, and she'd vanished. And so they got a posse together. A couple of local people noticed that there was an eagle in the nearby mountain that was acting a bit strange. They climbed up the mountain. They found her asleep on a ledge, rescued her, and saved her. And she got cuts and bruises, and she was fine. She died in 2010. She was 81, I think.
Okay.
Now, nobody saw it happen. She vanished, and then she was found halfway up a mountain. They say she was between 3 and 5 years old. They're not really sure, date-wise, exactly how old she was. They don't believe... Well, the explanation is she wandered off and climbed up a mountain, which is peculiar, because usually children don't go up if they wander off. They go down. They follow the gradient. And she was found at an elevation of 800 feet, I think it was, and she was 1,700 feet from her home.
That's a long way for essentially a toddler, a very young child.
Exactly. And why would you wander off when you've got your family farm and your parents behind you? Why would you go that way? Why would you not wander home? And so people have just dismissed it as a tall tale, or she wandered off. But because we've got no sort of first-hand evidence of anything being seen, But then again, nobody heard a scream or anything. But you're kind of trying to create an explanation for a weird event. Regardless, the fact that a child's found 800 foot up a mountain with no good reason of getting there, and like I say, it took 3 experienced climbers to find her. And
she told the story that an eagle had snatched her.
She did at first, and then she kind of forgot about it when she did interviews later on, but her parents would often talk about it. So that kind of thing, I think most of us, when we think about our childhood, it's often weird when we speak to people who can remember things from that 3, 4, 5 years old very clearly. It seems as though there is this part of our brain that kind of pushes that away because we don't really need it anymore. I think most people, if you start asking them about early childhood memories, it's very short snapshots of anything, and usually it's around birthdays or Christmases or weird strange events or traumatic events more than anything. But if you ask them what they did on their 5th birthday, often they'll not remember. So that part of it, her not remembering it properly, doesn't surprise me. And also, if it was traumatic, the brain is a wonderful way of suppressing those kind of memories to help us.
Yeah, and and of course sometimes those memories come from looking at old pictures and family stories, and then we feel we remember it, but it's, as you say, it's coming from family. So it doesn't mean that she didn't experience that. She probably did, but yeah, I would even think it's a trauma. So perhaps why those memories were submerged.
Absolutely, I know people that are terrified of pigeons, Kevin. Never mind an eagle.
I used to be terrified of chickens until because I think I thought they would peck and it would hurt.
Yeah.
Until one time I was on a farm. It was a winery and a farm. So I probably had a few glasses of wine, and I wandered out, and you could feed the chicken, put a quarter get the corn from the feeder, and I'm letting them peck me, and it's not bothering me. Like, oh, this actually feels kind of good. Now I want chicken, but I can't have chicken.
Yeah. Mobile acupuncture. That's what that is.
Exactly.
I suppose as well, when you've been diving into this and looking into it, as I say, they're 2 examples off the top of my head that I can think about. There will be other stories of this, and we both know there are stories of people on the frontier confronting giant birds of all descriptions and stuff. When you've been speaking to other people about this, because obviously, like as I said to you earlier, you've become kind of the person that's the Thunderbird man.
I appreciate that. That's very nice of you to say.
I would imagine you've had other people, other researchers, other cryptozoologists, other Forteans sharing information with you, sending you things, finding other articles that you might have missed in this. Have you ended up finding out more weird giant bird stories, as well as everybody else having this weird memory of this picture that nobody can find anymore?
I've interviewed a number of witnesses to actual thunderbirds or giant birds or whatever you want to call them. A very good one came from Pennsylvania. I think there was absolutely something going on in the early 70s in Pennsylvania. There's so many sightings. So this gentleman, he was a teenager back then, but he, and it wasn't really until later in life that he heard, the Thunderbird is a thing. And so when he was on a vacation at his family's cabin and driving with his grandfather, and just had an encounter where this large bird flew over the truck that seemed to have, the bird he estimated had about a 14-foot wingspan. And I know that when you see something in the sky, you can misjudge it, especially when it goes by quickly. But this guy is like, he was an engineer for a living. I think he worked on nuclear submarines and things. Mm-hmm. So he knew how wide the road was and the tree line. And so, I really don't, it was one of the most credible witnesses I've ever spoken to. And it wasn't outrageous, a 14-foot wingspan, a golden eagle, which is the largest, land bird you're going to find here outside the condor, is like a 7, about a 7-foot wingspan approximately. Condor is about 10. So there's something unusual there. And it was right at that time where there were numerous sightings. So, I don't know if that means that, and most of them are described as like large eagles. So were there abnormally large birds of known species back then? It makes me wonder. And I've talked to other witnesses, and then there have been some cases that are a little more out there. One person saw what looked like almost like a teratorn, but he said it was glistening, which I've heard You hear sometimes that in Bigfoot stories where there's almost like it goes into that like interdimensional idea that some people talk about, or like it's almost like they're passing through. There's something about them that's not 100% flesh and blood, and sometimes the people almost feel like it's a personalized experience. You know, like it almost, it's not a vision, but something that is meaningful to them personally. So it's interesting that sometimes the Thunderbird accounts go into that direction, which kind of ties back to what it originally was.
I find it perplexing as well, Kevin, because we know gigantism affects most living creatures on this planet under the right circumstances. The right mixture of chromosomes and genes can send all kinds of creatures to develop very strangely. We see it very rarely in humans, although you look at certain, I mean, even something as common as basketball players. People think they're all giants, but they're not really. There's not many over 7 foot. There's a lot of, you know, big 6'6", 6'7" guys wandering around. I mean, my gang, as we were knocking about as teenagers, one of them was 6'4" and one of them was 6'5". Giants, even as teenagers, you know. And you think of people like Robert Ludlow, who's obviously the tallest man who ever lived, but obviously due to his condition, he didn't live very into old age. Extreme pain, had to use canes. Doing anything was absolutely agonizing for him. And we see it in creatures all around the world, that you'll get these freaks of nature where they're much bigger and much larger. Same as albinism. Sometimes it can just happen for no reason other than some kind of genetic throwback. And yet when it comes to birds, it's almost as if it's off the table. It can't affect birds. And you think, well, that doesn't make sense, because everything else gets like this. And we can see it in certain breeds of birds that we're a bit more aware of, that occasionally you will get, like we were joking earlier on, sometimes you'll see a pigeon, like, bloody hell, that's the biggest pigeon I've ever seen in my life. It's like it's been down the gym all week. Yeah.
Am I wait? No, it's is it chips?
Well, chips, but yeah, when we go to McDonald's, they all sell French fries. So,
okay, all right, that's interesting.
Because it confuses it doesn't anymore. Obviously, when you guys talk about chips, you mean crisps. And if we talk about chips, you think we're talking about crisps. Exactly. But we're not. We're talking about fries. And
okay. And so, in McDonald's, marketing is so powerful that they've retained the French fries name. That's
Even here, it doesn't matter. But people still have chips. They don't say, "Oh, we're going to have steak and French fries" when they're cooking at home. Okay, it's not permeated it. It's in the threshold of fast food joints, they're French fries. Outside of that, it's chips.
Good to know.
So yeah, birds, for me, why do you think that people just disregard that there could be incidents of gigantism in certain breeds? Because it just needs the right conditions, the right food. They may even stumble across, I mean, we've had examples of bees finding dumped barrels of Skittles and creating multicoloured honey in the past because they've been licking the sugar coatings. Yeah. So, and creating these incredible sort of hives full of multicoloured hexagons, and everybody's like, what's going on here? And
I gotta get them to decorate here.
And so why couldn't we get a giant eagle every so often that's got a 10, 12, 14 foot wingspan? Why is that so difficult for some people to believe could exist?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I've gone down this route of thought a lot, and I haven't been able to find like scientific papers getting into gigantism in birds. It's just, I don't know if it hasn't really been studied. What you can do, I mean, it's anecdotal, but if you look back at some of those I talk about all those reports of eagles snatching children. Now, obviously, some you have to take with a grain of salt, but a lot of those reports in the old newspapers, I mean, they're fairly straightforward, and a lot of the eagles described that are slightly bigger than what you see today. And, this was before, I mean, speaking of the United States, DDT did a number on these birds, and throughout like the second half of the 20th century, power lines and just natural resources that we've gobbled up. So how could that not have an effect on their size? I would think. So I think I definitely think, there could have been known eagles that were just a little bit larger because they had the diet and, and so forth, and genetically it went in that way. And maybe some of those survived, for example, like, I mean, northern Pennsylvania is like one of the most remote areas of the country even today. I mean, it's just that, the forest. As I said, I've been there, and you could imagine, like I can imagine something hiding out, that's not being seen every day. So it could just be that, maybe these, and even if it's some bird that amazingly, it's an undiscovered species. I could see that there are certain patches of the wilderness and so forth where maybe they could be, and they wouldn't be seen all the time.
Well, I think this is often the arrogance of modern life, Kevin, is that because we've flown drones and planes over everywhere and photographed everything, we presume that we've discovered everything, which I find a very strange belief system to hold, because just because you've seen a picture of a tree doesn't mean you know what lives in it. And I absolutely flatly deny anybody that tells me that we know exactly what's in Alaska and the northern provinces of Canada, because no bugger goes there. And right. Alaska is one of the harshest environments that anybody lives in. The population is tiny. The size of the state is enormous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's probably the population's congregated in certain areas of it. Yeah. So there are, large swaths that are, uninhabitable.
Yeah, precisely. It's very similar to Australia, because Australia, everybody goes, oh, well, there can't be anything unknown living there. But I think something like 90% of the population live within 150 miles of the coast. Mm-hmm. But Australia is as large as America, and it has a tenth of the population. So you can't tell me that everybody's been across Australia and discovered everything, and everybody's been up every mountain in Alaska. You only have to look at how many people disappear in Alaska on an annual basis to think, well, there's something weird going on here. Yes, it might be the weather. It might be just drunk people wandering off and falling down a mountain or being eaten by a bear or something. Mm-hmm. But it then becomes such a large number that you think, this is a bit odd, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. It's hard to imagine that there's that much that we don't know about, because we're so populous and so digitally connected. But I really don't think we know everything.
Well, exactly. And we're still, you only have to look at the Amazon and these occasional glimpses of tribes that have still not been contacted by the outside world. And I often think, well, good luck to them. You go near them, they'll start throwing spears and blowing arrows at you. Basically,
they've learned.
We've seen what happened to the previous tribe, and they're not there anymore. It's that, and you just think, just leave them alone. We've got enough stuff, right? Just leave them. If they want to come and talk to us, then that's fine. They know where we are, and they haven't been yet. So take that, your hint. And so we find things where we're not expecting them. Animals can turn up in the strangest of places. Creatures that are often said to have been extinct are suddenly rediscovered in a pocket that they didn't know in. I mean, you only have to look at what we would consider normal creatures in regards to cougars and mountain lions in the States, where certain officials will say, there's absolutely no cats here.
The official position of a lot of the game, the natural wildlife and game departments is like, nope, there are no mountain lions here. Yet then one's like killed on the road or something. It's like, obviously that's not correct.
Oh, it was a released pet, Kevin. What's wrong with you? Come on.
I know. and coyotes, I mean, are you getting this where you are? I mean, the surge of coyotes is kind of troubling. I've seen them, here in New Jersey, and I used to think a coyote was only in Roadrunner cartoons. It's like you just didn't expect them in this part of the country.
Well, it just shows you that if you give animals the opportunity to just get on with it, they will just reappear everywhere. I mean, I remember speaking to David Weatherly about this. I've mentioned this a few times on the show. He was doing something, we were talking about cats, big cats, and he was told by a state official that the Florida panther would not cross the border into Georgia. As though he was absolutely convinced that panther didn't want to go to Georgia, which I just thought was the most palpable nonsense I've ever heard, because it's a wild animal. It doesn't care what you think or what the state line is. If it's going to go, it's going to go. And like you said, there's pictures from all over the states of cats, coyotes, wolves being in places that they're not supposed to be. I mean, they've only recently, in the last 10 years, discovered that coyotes and wolves can breed. And we've now got coy wolves, which was something that was dismissed as urban myths or rural people just telling tall tales. Now we know that's a real thing. So come on.
So keep your mind open. I mean, we're always being proven wrong. So
Absolutely. I mean, one of the other aspects that I find so wonderful about your book, on top of all this wonderful giant bird mysteries that we have from all over the place. It's some of these incredible stories that sort of make you sort of chuckle and scratch your head at the same time. What came first for you, Kevin? Was it weirdness in general, or was it monsters and giant creatures of a varying description, or was it the weirdness pulled you in and then that became your thing? Or do you just love it all and you're just focusing on Thunderbirds?
It goes back a long way. I mean, I mentioned this in the book. I track it back to third grade elementary school library. There was Ian Thorne wrote a series of books called Search for the Unknown. They were just kind of slim volumes. They had green covers, beautiful artwork of like the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, Bigfoot. Those books just like they ruined me. I couldn't get enough. And I'm dead, so personally, but I'm attracted to anything kind of out of the norm. So while I was investigating the Thunderbird photograph and anything I could find about large, oversized birds, they're just these, all these other stories just, but I've always collected them like in my head or in books. And so I think, the driving force, as I say, was kind of like taking those stories and then just trying to expand the world around them, like, especially when you can find out, like, one of the best ones was so this is a little OCD, but so I wanted to call the book, I wanted to include the word lost temples in the book. But originally I just had the chapter about the Serpent Temple.
Yes. And
I briefly mentioned like the Grand Canyon ruins, but I'm like,
yeah,
it bothered me that I only had one chapter about a lost temple and where I had lost temples in the title. So I'm like, let me come up with another one.
Yeah.
Right. So I just started doing searches for that. And I come across this one in El Paso, Texas. And lo and behold, this became one of the largest, most time-consuming research projects I've ever conducted. It's 100 pages in the book, and it's because I thought it was such this interesting story that the discoverer of this temple, supposedly, I found out was one of the most prolific con men I've ever heard about, probably in U.S. world history. He starting in Austria and then moving to the United States and moving across the United States. He continually fooled people into thinking he was very educated, or he came across as educated. Leo Burson, he would scam people. He would start a school and then scam people out of money. He would sort of like get people's sympathies. He would tell them he would pose as a clergyman. He would pose as a professor, and he would do all these things until you get to this story where he claims to find this buried Aztec temple under Texas, which is not where you would expect it. It should be further south.
Yeah.
And it turned out that he had a connection in El Paso, that there was this man in town who owned the property where he said the temple was. And this guy was very close with the president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz. And at the time, Diaz had like a mandate to build the country, Mexico's reputation as like a modern metropolis with this deep history. So he was trying to gather all of the historical artifacts he could from its pre-Hispanic past. So I began to be like, is he trying to scam the president of Mexico to like get money? Because he would get money for these, and it just became this whole saga. Again, you don't have all the answers, but it just became this just fascinating picture of this person in this place and time. And it also happened to involve, a fun story about this buried temple that may or may not have been. A lot of people claim that they saw it. So is it still there? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the intriguing thing about this now is, though, Kevin, as well, is that we've suddenly started finding things in Central and South America that nobody's seen for the best part of 2,000 years.
Using satellites and ground penetrating radar, they were hidden away. Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Josh Gates and his shows, regardless of the topics that he covers, because I just find him a very endearing and engaging host. And he's got such a passion for history and archaeology and mystery as well, and he's someone that is all in on the Yeti because of his personal experiences, which is one of the most intriguing documentaries I think he's ever done, primarily because it's got some footage from Japan, which has very rarely been seen over here, which is clearly showing something standing up and walking about on a mountainside in the Himalayas, which isn't a bear, as far as I'm aware, and it certainly doesn't look like a bear unless bears have learnt to do that when they walk. And so when Josh has been going into some of these places and rediscovering these lost temples and settlements in that kind of area, it just shows you, because once again, we're working on this principle of, well, we know about this bit, we know about the Incas, we know about the Aztecs, we know what the Spanish did down in South and Central America, we know everything we need to know. Well, we keep finding these lost cities. I mean, they're enormous as well. It's not like it's 6 huts around a fire, Kevin. These are complex structures which clearly show a level of intelligence, which I think the last one has basically changed the entire history of what we thought South American tribes were able, because we just thought they were all hunter and gatherers 2,500 years ago. Now we know that they were forward thinking enough to be building cities. And so once again, 5 years, we've completely changed the opinion of South America technically overnight in archaeological terms.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why, I wouldn't discount some of these old stories, especially. So even though in the case I was talking about, okay, so he was a con man. Does that mean this was a con? Because it doesn't fit any of his other MOs. And it was a guy who had a passion for archaeology. So, maybe there was something there. Maybe it wasn't what he thought it was too. It could have been a Pueblo dwelling or something like that. But there are details sometimes that, are intriguing. Like those old articles mention that it was made of white marble, right? And where did he pull that detail? Well, it turns out there's a mine for white marble in Texas, not very far from where this was. So it is plausible that maybe that, was there an offshoot, that traveled there and built something and they used these local minerals? I mean, makes you wonder.
Well, this is the thing. I think sometimes we presume we know everything about the history of certain cultures, I think, based on the historical record. But often they're only written by the victors, Kevin, in all aspects. Yes. And we'll very often skimp on some details or just not bother telling us about things. And yet we can now begin to look back at these with a more critical eye and start to peel away the layers of propaganda often that covers these stories and these reports that have been written by the invaders. And so we can now begin to look at this. And I've often been extremely intrigued by some of these stories that come from North America. As you mentioned, the Grand Canyon and these mysterious rooms full of Egyptian artifacts.
I love these stories.
And we're talking about con man. You've obviously got the Lemurians, where they appear from is all about a con because of the mysterious temple of gold that's under Mount Shasta. And so there seems to be a real trend of this wish that there are these lost temples hiding away somewhere. But when you're talking about sort of the southern US states, when we're talking about New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and some at Louisiana and places like this, because they're so close to what is the modern Mexican border, and we know that the Mexicans got into that, and we know that there are stories of the Aztecs getting further up North America than we've previously begun to think. And so once again, that seems to be something that's evolving. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that there could be something hidden somewhere out there in Texas or New Mexico, that because we know how nature works, be it a jungle that takes over everything, that as we can see in Central and South America, or the desert reclaims things, as we can see in the Sahara and Mongolia and places like that. There are things that we stumble across that have been covered for centuries, which also is the intriguing hook for some of these mysteries, that we found things that match up, but not in those particular places. So why can't there be a lost temple in El Paso?
I mean, the Aztecs, their ancestors, the Mexica, likely came. There's their own stories told of coming from north, which would put them like in the American Southwest, or further north of Mexico. So I'm not saying they were building things at that point, but it shows that it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that there would have been travel. And even if, sometimes it could be a cultural osmosis as well. You might, maybe there's certain traditions because they trade it, they had contact with, these different groups. So, maybe some of that was picked up and something was built elsewhere. I'm not an archaeologist, so, but it's fascinating. And I think it shows that sometimes it's easy to say just any of these old stories are bunk, but when you dig into them, you see that there's a thread there that might be worth looking into.
I mean, you only have to look at mounds, really. That for me, living in the UK, I don't understand why there's. It seems to me, Kevin, that there seems to be some kind of official reticence to find out who built these blooming things, because they're all over the place. And so the tribes have often said, when they're asked about this, and the nations, they say, well, they were here when we got here. And you think, well, right. so who's come down first then? Because obviously the general perception is everybody came across the land bridge from Siberia and came across and came down. Which obviously I mean, I was speaking recently and we were discussing the possibility that rather than people walking down, they came in boats and just sort of sailed along the coastline until the ice stopped and probably dropped off, I don't know, in Oregon or Washington State or California, and then came across. Which, this is another thing, we often think that people only sailed certain places, and yet, why would they? History is full of incredible voyages. I mean, as we mentioned at the beginning, we were talking about Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts. These are legendary quests, usually involving boats, and they seem to go to all over these mysterious places. And yet we're supposed to believe that all the Europeans stopped at Africa and didn't go anywhere else, and nobody in Asia was going anywhere. But we know they must have, because there are so many islands in the Pacific that have been populated that you can only get to by boat. So
the Vikings made it to North America. It's...
Well, exactly, and we know that for a fact now, even though people still go on about Columbus discovering America. How you can discover a place people live is beyond me. But even so, that's still put forward as the first European in North America. The evidence proves that that's absolute nonsense now. We know the Norse got there 500, 400 years beforehand, and that also leads to an intriguing story of an encounter with a group of hairy people that scared them off. And people say, oh, well, they were Native Americans, First Nations people, and they weren't used to seeing people with dark skin, which we know is palpable nonsense because the Norse got to Africa and they were in the Middle East. They were in Jerusalem and places like that throughout the Crusades. They'd seen people from all over the world at that point. They would not have been surprised to see somebody who was dark-skinned. Right. I find that a very odd sort of explanation, because it clearly shows that you don't know where the Norse went.
And, just going back to the rock for a second, I mean, it's thought that Arab traders, went to Madagascar and came across some of these large bird species that are now extinct. They were alive in living memory, in the historical record. So it can see how that could have influenced those stories as well. And then those stories came back and spread across the continent.
Well, as we were saying about the moa and the Haast eagle, the Haast eagle died out because the moas were pushed to the brink of extinction, so they didn't have the food source anymore. So, who's to say that there wasn't a race of giant birds living in that particular area off the African coast or one of the islands in the Indian Ocean that was feeding on some particular animal that we once again hunted or pushed to the brink? You only have to wonder how many rhinos and elephants and the like were across the African continent 1,000 years ago, Kevin, to think, well, I'm not suggesting that there are birds flying around like the Rock was renowned for being able to pick elephants and rhinos up and have those for breakfast. I'm not suggesting that, but you can't tell me that there couldn't possibly have been a large bird that would perhaps have eaten children or people even. Sure. Or sort of lion cubs or baby rhinos or baby elephants, because there are certain birds that will still go for things. I mean, there's a certain breed of bird that attacks and eats live sheep. Yeah,
and they've been filmed carrying them. I think they're young sheep. Yeah. I think, but
lambs and goat kids. I've seen that footage of eagles taking them. So
there's a reintroduced eagle. Is it in Scotland?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm blanking on with these species specifically, but yeah, it was introduced, and there was a conflict with farmers because it was like flying off with their or killing their lives.
They've had some recent issues with golden eagles that have been reintroduced and protected. They are the ones that are coming.
Yeah.
And obviously it's a crime to steal their eggs, hurt them, whatever. But yeah, there's been a few where golden eagles have been killed by poachers for whatever reason, or allegedly. But they've had issues with beavers being reintroduced as well. So it's not only things in the air. They don't like anything, it would seem. Even though we know that these are the best things for in the environment. It's what balances is required in all aspects of life.
Yep, and we're very good at upsetting that balance and killing off one species. And you're right. It's a chain reaction.
Absolutely. How many times can we think what's the worst can happen happens?
I know.
Yeah. I mean, and I've mentioned this before. You only have to look at what Yellowstone did with wolves and how that's impacted it. And you think, how can reintroducing wolves do what it's done? But it's just shown you that ecological damage of taking a predator out has caused the flora there, because the deer were just, we do what we want, there's no stress here. Let's just eat all these lovely flowers all day, every day, because we've no reason to move. Now, the whole ecosystem's rebounding because everything has to move around still.
Yep, good point.
And so when we look at this, that's what I just find fascinating, because as you say, we've got these kernels of truth in some of these old stories of lost temples of giant creatures. And you think, well, there are outliers here. There are incidents where we've discovered things that aren't supposed to exist, or find species that are supposed to have vanished, or in a museum drawer for 30, 40 years, Kevin. Why can't there be these things? I
also think we're driven by that love of mystery in our life. I don't think we all want everything codified and explained. There's like a pushback on that. I think it's just part of the human psyche. We're attracted to the unknown and thinking that the world can match what we have in our imaginations.
Speaking of the unknown, I think the chapter that really made me ponder my place in the world, Kevin, is the Illinois Cloud Man.
Yeah.
Now, I spoke to somebody recently who told me a very interesting story about an elemental being associated with storms here in the UK, which is not a well-known kind of folk belief. It's one of those things that seems to have completely fallen out of fashion yet. But speaking to that person and hearing that has made me want to find out and see if there are any more kind of reports or beliefs of that are still hanging out there in some of these, because British folklore is having a massive resurgence over the last 20 years. It's one of the great positives of the internet, that it's reconnected a lot of people, and British folklore had kind of been pushed to the margins.
There's that book that with I'm sorry, getting this vision of there's a book of British folklore that was popular like 30, 40 years ago. It's got like a golden embossed head on the cover. I've always wanted that book.
Absolutely. That's one of those books. I had that when I was a kid in the 80s, and it's one of them you just kind of lose. Now it's like, I think you can get a copy for 150 quid second hand.
Okay. Wow. I think it's called British Folklore, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if it was a Reader's Digest one, because they made some incredible books through the 70s and 80s of this particular thing. But yeah, I think it featured on a recent cover of 40 and Times, and everybody started talking about it, saying, I've got this, I've got that. And so I'm just very envious of these people, and I'll just break, Kevin, and buy a copy off eBay for too much money and probably read it once and put it down for a year. But I'd never heard of the Illinois Cloud Man.
I'd never heard of it either until just looking through digital archives, which I spend so much of my free time doing. I think I typed in quotes, singular phenomenon, which was something you see, it's sort of that old timey kind of speak that, you see in a lot of these articles. So, and I was just seeing what came up. And this article popped up. It was only printed in a local Illinois paper, and it told it was a letter. It was a letter from a man who said that there had been, during this period of storms, they had been traveling on the road, and the clouds formed into the shape of a man and came after them and chased them across the field. And they were terrified. And then they turned to run, they ran, and then they heard like an explosion, and there was an odd smell in the air. I think it was kind of like sulfur, and turned around and it was gone. And, and they were like, and the tone was, was basically like, look, I don't know what this was. I hope no one else ever experiences. It was a very impassioned letter. I'm like, I don't, and it turns out, there were 2 days of these horrible storms in the Midwest, and there are a record number of tornadoes there. Like the reporting for, going back to the 1800s, or, it really doesn't start until like 1950s that, the Weather Service was keeping track of these. So you really don't know. But based on, there has been a study of like newspaper reports and everything. And so, I mean, it's a high number then, just like it was now. So I'm thinking, was this a tornado? So I posted this article online, but as it turns out, it wasn't finished yet, because someone said, that sounds like a dead man walking tornado. And I look it up, and, you gotta remember this original story happened in, I think it was it the 1860s? I'd have to look at it. It was a long time ago. So in the 1990s, there was a very deadly tornado in Jarrell, Texas. And there's a famous image that was there was a man who was he was essentially like right next to where where a funnel was forming, and he took a series of pictures. In one of the photos, the tornado developed multiple vortices, and it gave the appearance of a giant figure kind of walking across the fields holding a scythe in its hand, kind of a Grim Reaper-esque kind of look to it.
Yeah.
And immediately after that is when the tornado, tore through a small community. I think they were like prefab or trailer homes, and killed many people.
Yeah.
So, and since then, now that we're photographing these things, so there have been others that have been recorded. There's one video. It looks like it's taking like just a stroll, like this tornado. It looks to our eyes, the way we put things together in our minds, like a person, like a figure, a human-esque figure, a human-like figure. So I think this story to me was clearly an early example of this. So here, it's easy to look at something like that and say, oh, it's just made up, or this is just kind of like some kind of high strangeness we'll never understand. Whereas, I mean, you're never going to have the concrete evidence, but it definitely sounds like this later phenomenon that wasn't documented until more than 100 years later. But it isn't. Yeah, it is a reminder of how powerful and deadly nature can be. All of a sudden, when you're not expecting.
Very much so, and I would be really interested. I think one of the things about the tribal nations of North America is we know tornadoes have gone on for time immemorial. So right. One can only imagine that there will be some kind of mythology around them, or, as we say, sometimes Thunderbirds can get sort of grouped as the bringer of storms in certain places.
I think the Thunderbird is really, and the Thunder are really looped in. Now, did they have a separate tradition for tornadoes? I'm not sure, but I know that, the Great Plains, tribes, the Thunderbird, it's kind of, the storms out there are extremely dramatic. The thunder in the distance and everything. So that definitely has a larger tie to those weather patterns. Whereas in some other regions, it has that connection, but it might be, again, more of a flesh and blood bird that's, like, as we said, going after whales or whatever. But yeah, so I that is something I'd like to look into. Is there like kind of a separate tornado, tradition that any of those groups had?
Because when I was reading that, because the only kind of weird thing or character that I'm aware of that's associated with storms or tornadoes or hurricanes in the Americas is obviously the Grey Man from the Carolinas.
Yes.
And when I was reading that, I was thinking, how many more of these have we got? Because obviously one of the wonderful things we have is that we have this history there that I think is still a really untapped resource from the indigenous peoples, that I would be amazed if there aren't other characters of similar things, like a dead man walking, or the cloud man, or the grey man. Though the grey man seems to be one of the weird ones, where it seems to be a saviour rather than a harbinger of doom. Whereas he comes, and if he turns up and you're there, your house is going to be okay. Whereas the others, when they turn up, it's all bets are off, and just hope for God it misses you. So when you were looking into the Cloud Man and Dead Man Walking, is this something, where does this tradition come from, this term? Because like you say, yes, you can sort of, your mind will always try and fixate and create faces and things with pareidolia, and our brain always wants to make sense of shapes and patterns. But clearly there is a history here of people perceiving some kind of supernatural entity or something, as I was mentioning about storm elementals, attached to them, whether for good or bad.
And the Dead Man Walking tornado and the Jarrell incident, there was a documentary on it. I mentioned it in the book. I think it was Weather Channel, where they do make a reference in it saying that there were it comes from Native American traditions, the Dead Man. And that it was the Dead Man Walking out. They don't source that, and I haven't found anything else on it, so I'm not sure where they got that fact from. So, but it is, if that's true, then it's possible that this is coming from traditions, from the Native Americans who live in that area of Texas.
Yeah, I mean, it always makes me chuckle because I was reading something the other week about an Australian UFO sighting, Kevin, and the Australian Air Force told the witness that what he'd seen wasn't a UFO, it was a tornado on the beach. And as an ex-pilot, he was both insulted and furious by their explanation, because he said, I'm quite aware of what a tornado looks like, and as far as I'm aware, they don't glow and have lights on them. And so whenever I see strange stories about tornadoes and what they supposedly have accompanying them, because there are obviously stories about UFOs being sighted in massive storms and things like that as well, even though that could be some kind of weird electronical discharge that's creating that kind of imagery. Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating because there's clearly something there that we know very little about in regards to traditions. And so are these things that people have just missed, like you say, because sometimes in this day and age, it's more about what you put in as a key term or a search word that guides you to there. And sometimes the language we use wouldn't be what somebody would write or use 120 years ago. Yeah,
that's so true. I mean, you really have to put yourself in the mind of the writer of that time. And it gets easier the more old, sources you read. You start to realize, okay, this is the turn of phrase that was more popular, like singular phenomenon, which, we know what it means, but I don't know how many people you hear say that today. Say something it's singular and like that. So yeah.
It's very intriguing. Very intriguing. I think the last topic I want to touch on before I let you return to the rest of your day, my friend, is this one. This was one of the few stories in the book that I had heard about, mm-hmm. but obviously not in the depth that you cover it, which is the giant skeleton monster that runs around Borrego. And this is also a very strange one because it seems to be quite unique. There aren't many places around the world where you have stories of giant skeletons terrorizing people. You have people that talk about skeleton ghosts in sort of Asian cultures and certainly in Africa, but this seems a very odd one. Yes,
it's like a gestalt.
Yes,
skeleton. Yeah, that's a cool one. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but
so this one is for me is fascinating because of its uniqueness, especially in North America.
It really, I think it really fits in with that prospecting post-gold rush culture.
Mm.
The way the skeleton is walking with a lantern, and you just have people that are out in these very unforgiving landscapes, just trying to find their fortune and coming across weird things. So that's a good one. And it's interesting that there are similar stories about just phantom lights in the same area.
Yes.
So, which is, Vincent Gaddis wrote a whole book on that. That's another, of course, that's another big phenomenon. So, if it speaks to, is it a fear of death that is always so quickly, you could easily find yourself in trouble being out in that environment. Is it just sort of like the quiet and, and the mystery of it? But the thing about the skeleton I thought was interesting was that it's not just your typical ghost story. It feels like almost like an automaton. Like in one case it was described as just sort of like, walking like with purpose across the hills, and then it would like get stuck in a valley and kind of walk around in a circle like it didn't know where it was, and then it would just kind of randomly going off in a different direction. It feels like somebody took a wind-up robot toy and set it loose. It's just the strangest story, and it comes. What I like about it is it was collected by a writer who spoke to those prospectors. These stories, they were documented like I think the 1930s. And so, there were people that had lived that history, which was quickly, you weren't seeing a lot of prospecting going on by that point. So it was already this celebrated time in American history. And yeah, I mean, I know some of these guys like sailors told tall tales, but it's definitely creepy, and just so bizarre, you wonder.
Well, it falls into that tradition because often we've got stories here about some of the pirates and smugglers that would exist around Cornwall and Devon who would claim that certain places were haunted to keep people away from where they were stashing all their loot. And so you would perhaps dismiss it maybe as, like you say, somebody's found a nice gold mine down there and they don't want anybody to find it, and therefore they want to tell everybody that there's the terrifying skeleton going for a wander around. But it does seem a bit strange because at the end of the day, these guys are tough, no-nonsense kind of people, Kevin. These people are working and trekking through very harsh environments. I find it hard that some of these grizzled men would have been put off looking for something just because old Bill says there's a skeleton lives in that valley. If anything, I'd be like, right, we're going to that valley.
See it for myself. Some of the prospectors did go looking for it. I don't think it put any. I can see what you're saying. It's sort of like Scooby-Doo. Like we create this ghost story and people they won't go bother me while I search for a treasure. But you're right. I think that only draws people there, which is falls back into why do we all love this stuff? We want to go find it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that you even now. I mean, I think it was fairly recently. I was watching something about the mysterious Lost Dutchman mine.
Yes.
Which is another one where people have spent, I don't know, the best part of 150 years looking for this.
Have died, died trying to find this. So it's a serious search, and it's not a joke, I mean, is it there? Is it not? People are definitely, they love the adventure of it, for at least.
Very much so. But the thing I took away from it most is the fact that he wasn't even Dutch. He was German. No. And therefore, they kind of set something off in my head, Kevin, because then I was thinking, of course, Dutch. Yes. They probably just shortened it. And then I was thinking, so that's why Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predators known as Dutch. Because I was thinking, why is his nickname
I never
Dutch?
thought about that. That's true. It's like the Pennsylvania Dutch, right? It was really Pennsylvania
yes.
Dutch.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I've suddenly realised they call him Dutch in that film because he's obviously got a German accent. And I'd never clocked it until I watched this documentary about the Dutchman mine.
That's a great revelation. I never hit me. Wow.
Makes perfect sense. Now it all makes sense. But when I'm, 40 years ago, I'm thinking, why is he called Dutch? He's clearly German. What American scriptwriters are like, thinking everybody's daft. No, I'm daft because I didn't understand the language history of it. Now it makes sense. But that one, even to this day, people still go looking for this mine. And like you say, was it ever really there? But we've got this tantalizing trail at the beginning where this grizzled old man on his deathbed's handing out gold nuggets left, right and centre. But it pulls people in because it's always men, but women went looking for it. People spend their lives when they believe that these lost treasures are there, Kevin, like you say. There are, I would suggest hundreds, if not thousands of people that have died looking for these lost treasures all around the world, not just the Dutchman's mine.
If there were as many treasures as there are legends about them, there would be a lot of rich people. But it's I think maybe there have been a few cases where people have found something, obviously, but I think some people it's a hobby, it's maybe a sense of purpose. There's that hope that they're going to be the one that solves this and finds that cachet. So.
Plus, you've also got to remember as well, these people were sort of hamstrung by the ability to what the tools they had available to them as well, Kevin, other than pickaxes and maybe if they were lucky they could have get some dynamite.
They're hoping they have an old map, on a piece of parchment. That's
X marks the spot. Yeah. And so you would think that maybe some of these things are still out there, but people just didn't have the tools to get to things. And now we just kind of dismiss them as old wives' tales or folk histories or just tall tales told by drunken frontiersmen in the 1890s. But why couldn't there be? Because, as you say, weird things pop up. Treasures still get found all over the place.
It has plausibility. I mean, this, especially with lost mines. I mean, there were thousands of people out mining, and looking for these things. And surely there are situations where they found something and then something befell the finder and it's still there somewhere, And I mean, if you've ever driven through, if you've ever driven out west, Arizona, parts of California, I mean, you go miles and miles drive miles and miles through the desert. You may not see another car. And if you actually go out into the, into those areas, I mean, no one's been there. There's a story I kind of related to this. If we have time, I'll share. This is one I'm still investigating. And it's such a cool idea. Okay, so there are these old stories about giant bird nests that were discovered around the Donner Trail. So like Utah, yes. Nevada, and there are photos of them. I mean, they were reported on like in the early 1900s, and it's sometimes they got blown up into being for giant birds, but there's a type of hawk which lives out there, and they would just build nests on top of each other over time. So these nests could be like 10 feet tall or more, like taller than you or I. And I began to wonder, like in the stories that talk about the discovery of these, it's so remote, because you have mud flats. I mean, it's a very, difficult environment a lot of the year.
Yeah.
So today that land, that portion of it, belongs to the military. So I ended up getting in touch with the Army, and just say, I know this is like an out there story. This is ancient history almost, but I wonder if you're aware of this. And I end up hearing back from a scientist in the Army who essentially says that, he thought it was compelling. He says, because there are these reports of these birds, we're kind of compelled to check this out now. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Because, they, in some of those areas, it's a test range, they do bombing and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's likely an area that nobody's been to recently, A, because it's remote, and B, because it's on restricted government land. So for a couple of years now, I know they've made a couple attempts to get out there. Often, like, their trucks can't get there. It's like just muddy, and, they have to wait for a dry season. And of course, it has to be at a time when they're free to do it. So like once a year or something, he checks in with me or I check in with him, and they haven't been out there to find it yet. But I'm fingers crossed. I want an ending to this story. I mean, and so if this particular hawk is out there, it's really a protected animal, and they want to know that that's its habitat. I hope it's still thriving in those areas and building these massive nests.
Well, this is a strange thing. Like you say, yes, it's a testing range and bombing site, but often that's the perfect thing because it stopped anybody else getting anywhere near them. So why wouldn't they still be there?
Right. And I mean, maybe if they dropped a bomb on them, if you look at it on Google Maps, I mean, there are like certain areas there. It's like it's cratered,
Yes.
They certainly did exist. It's documented. It's just nobody thought about it for 100 years.
Another mouth-watering mystery to end our conversation, Kevin. I shall dive into this and go looking for that. As soon as you said the word Donner, I was already in there because that's obviously a very intriguing story. I terrified a woman recently in the local charity shop because somebody had handed in a full book about the Donner Party.
Oh.
And so when I bought it, the lady said, "Oh, what's that about?" So I kind of told her, I gave her the sanitized version of it. And even that looked like it had terrified her, and she wasn't going to sleep very well that night, Kevin. But that's just my public service of scaring normal people.
It's a real life horror story for sure.
Well, it's one of those. It's remarkable anybody survived, regardless of requirements. And as I've often said, there for the grace of God go any of us. That if you ever find yourself in a situation very similar to the rugby team in the Andes in the 70s, until it happens to you and you're in a situation where you've got no choice, then I'm sorry, you can't say what you would and wouldn't do in that kind of scenario.
And I mean, and you could still see their wagon tracks and, like wheels from carts that broke and thing up into like back in at least going back to the early 1900s. Yeah. Like that was also, now some of that, I know that there are periodic floods and things, so I don't know if all that's still there, but it's just to show how untouched and remote that area is. I mean, those things were still there for a long, long time after.
Yeah, I mean, not far from where I live, Kevin, we've got a place known as the Dark Peak, which essentially is scattered with the wreckage of numerous aircraft.
Oh my God.
And so you can go there on a good day, you can go there and wander around the remnants of crashed airplanes.
Oh wow.
All up there from sort of the Second World War test flights that have crashed into the mountain due to the fog and stuff. And so that, we're not talking one or two. I think there's 46, 47 planes up there, the wreckages of them. Some of them are thought to be, and I've spoken to somebody who told me a story about taking somebody up there to look at one, and as they were talking, the people with him stopped talking and they ran away, and he didn't understand why they ran away until he caught up with them. And as he was talking to them, apparently a ghost pilot just appeared behind him and started sort of walking towards these two men. They were terrified. They ran off.
Wow.
So you don't know. But that's in the modern era. So, and nobody's touching it. Nobody's cleaning up. They've just been left as like a resting place.
And that's a place of high trauma. And, it's I'm sure they weren't all survived. They didn't survive all those flights, I'm sure.
No. So who knows? Who knows what's out there, my friend? Well, Kevin, thank you for taking us on a journey into American strangeness. Where can everybody get a hold of a copy of this wonderful book with some of these wonderful stories, as well as following your work online, sir?
Okay. Well, the book is an Anthology of American Strangeness, Volume 1. It's on Amazon in both Kindle and paperback formats. My website is thunderbirdphoto.com, where I post articles that some end up in the book, some don't, but there's a regular flow of cool stories on there.
Fabulous. Well, I'll put links to both in the show notes as always. And I just want to say thank you for joining me for the first time. I sincerely hope it's not the last conversation we have about some of the weird strangeness you love and I love. And I look forward to our next chat, and you can educate me about some other weird and wonderful things you've discovered. Kevin, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Paul. Anytime.